You've seen the grant command before where you can grant access to individual persons or roles, but there are some other discretionary access controls where you can be very specific. Take, for example, this grant statement below, where we grant select on Myers Jack.students to a user Adam, but only for a certain number of rows, only where the gender is female. So this is a way to be very discretionary and very specific on granting a subset of a table to users, although this technique cannot be used in MySQL. Because of that, if you're in MySQL, what you would need to do was you would need to make a view that would restrict the rows and then use the grant command against the view. There's also another way to grant privileges. You can grant privileges with the grant option. What that allows a user who has that permission to further grant. This is not a good idea. We'll talk about this soon. And then the opposite of the grant command is obviously the revoke command, and you can grant permissions and you can easily revoke them as well. Now, let's talk about enforcing the security policy. Granting with the grant option is never a good idea because then you have no idea who has access. And we have an example here. We have these three users, U1, U2, and U3. And these users are involved in a grant relationship. So U2 has a privilege on an object from U1 and grants the privilege to U3. So now U1 had the original privilege. They granted privilege to U2, and U2 turned around and granted to U3. Later, U1 also grants privilege to U3, but then U2 revokes privilege from U3. And U3 would then still have the access privilege from U1 to access the object, even though U2 revoked the privilege. So you want to avoid a situation where one user can grant privileges and another user can grant privileges, because then it gets really hard to enforce that security. So you don't want to do that. So my advice is never to use the grant option. And the grant option can also be used in something called the Trojan horse attack. The Trojan horse attack says that you can grant privilege of a user to another user without knowing any information about them. So if a lot of people have grant options and they are compromised, then someone could go in and just use that to grant to someone else in the system, maybe make their own account, and then attack from the user that has permission, like U2, and then have U2 grant permission to a malicious entity. So you want to avoid that. You really want to not let the grant option happen. Let U1 be in charge of the grants and only U1. Keep the control to the owner of the database. One last trick around discretionary access control, and that is the use of roles. If you have a big company, it becomes very easy for people to change departments and basically collect privileges. So you might be in one department, have one set of privileges, move to a different department, have a different job function, but then still retain all the privileges that you had that you no longer need. Over time, this becomes very problematic. So the best thing to do would be to create roles. Here's how you can do it. You can create a role. We created a role called the HR developer, the HR read role, and the HR admin role. And then instead of granting access to individuals, we grant access to roles. And then we can have one set of roles, one set of privileges for an entire group of individuals. And the way we would then associate the role with the user is like our last grant statement: grant the HR admin role to Betty at localhost. And this way that Betty will pick up all the assignments to HR admin. She'll have select, insert, update, delete on all the tables. She'll have select, insert, update, and delete on all the recruitment tables. And she'll have select access on all the payroll tables. So you're able to really be very granular with your permissions. Then, if Betty does leave HR and transfer to sales, you simply have to do two things on her change of department. You revoke her HR admin role, and you grant her her new role. Using role-based security is a perfect example of how to implement the principle of least privilege, and it's a great way to keep track of the grants that you have given as a database administrator.